from love. This involves revisioning global relations of structural violence and ways they shape intimate, personal lives. So there is a connection between structural relations of men's power and the exercise of violence in intimate relations, both physically but also mentally, in refusing to listen and to understand, and in exercising power as violence, as a way of silencing what men often do not want to hear. As I argued in a new book called Transforming Masculinities, we need to be able to rethink or to think across the boundaries of the personal and the political, the structural and the intimate, in ways that fully recognize diverse cultural histories and traditions. This means questioning universalist theories of hegemonic masculinities, often framed within Western Anglo-American assumptions that would implicitly reproduce Western assumptions, Anglo-American assumptions, in the separations they would make, for instance, in Connell's work, between the therapeutic and the political. This calls for a different epistemology, able to validate different forms of embodied knowledge, so easily dismissed as subjective or personal or anecdotal within prevailing positivist traditions within the social sciences, as well as different public policies that we will also be discussing in a plenary in the conference, that acknowledge that heterosexual men, as the bearers of power, can also live limited lives with closed hearts and little contact with their own emotional lives. It is through these restrictions that terrible violence on women's bodies and homophobic violence is often generated. As men, we have to take responsibility for the terrible violence men often perpetrate on women, and we have to question the cultural assumptions which makes that violence legitimate, even normal, even part of everyday routine life. Where women are hit because they cannot reason for themselves, it is in some way for their own good. So that there are ideologies of gender and masculinity which make legitimate abusive relations, both in relationship to domestic violence, but also in relationship to homophobic violence. How do we recognize and take responsibility for those forms of violence while not shaming heterosexual masculinities, but giving men a conviction that a commitment to gender equality will in fact enrich their lives and allow for a deeper love and contact in their intimate relations. So often for men, feelings of vulnerability, of fear, are experienced as threatening because they are experienced as signs of weakness and so as threats to masculine identities. So as that feeling of vulnerability, of sadness, even the sadness of Mexico being 2-0 down, that feeling of vulnerability or sadness can so quickly be transformed into anger and violence, because that anger or the exercise of that violence affirms male identities, allows men to feel that they are man enough, and allows them to reject their feelings of vulnerability, sadness, and fear as part of their humanity. The profound challenge that gender theories, both feminist theory and queer theories, make within the social sciences and the humanities is to recognize the dignity and value of emotional life, and to begin to revision the very conception of what it means to be human. What it means to be human in ways that allow for the validation of a whole range of feelings. Vulnerability or sadness is no more tied to a feminine gender, than it should be to masculinities. But within a rationalist culture that shapes so many of our intellectual disciplines, we learn to discount emotional life, and so we learn to silence questions around violence, which traditionally have been framed as being on the margins of the social sciences. Violence has been understood